Okay, hi everybody. I'm Matt Billman. I'm CEO and co-founder of Netlify. For those of you who don't know Netlify, we're a platform that allows you to deploy, build, and manage front-end web applications and websites. And we are very centered around like sort of this idea of the JAMstack, this concept of modern web projects being built with JavaScript APIs and markup. The sense that you ship markup, as much pre-built markup as you can, directly to a CDN. You use JavaScript as the runtime in the browser and talk to different APIs and services from there. And it's been pretty amazing to see over the last couple of years like a whole ecosystem emerge around the JAMstack. Lots of headless CMSs like Contentful or Prismic or Forestry, and site generators like Gatsby or Noxt or ViewPress or Hugo, and products like Commerce Layer or Pilon or Snipcart. But one of the things that's also been fascinating and that sort of brought me here is that we've also seen a lot of the more traditional players start embracing this. We see lots of people today working with headless WordPress or headless Drupal. We've seen Ghost really splitting up their architecture. Their founder called me and say like we're completely splitting up Ghost to be like decoupled and decoupling the front end and the back end, because we believe that anybody that doesn't do this will be irrelevant architecturally within the next 5 years. We've seen like Craft CMS working on this, even like big enterprise CMSs like Sitecore or Magnolia starting to embrace decoupled approaches. And the reason for this is really that this sort of gives the front-end developers superpowers, right? And I think a lot in the Drupal community that this kind of conference came out of has probably seen initially that in Drupal there was a certain sort of tension between like the front-end developers that just wanted to work with modern like frameworks and React and Vue and so on, and then a very tightly integrated like templating and presentation layer with the content management layer that sort of created sometimes a lot of tension there. Decoupling that sort of gives a lot of powers to the front-end developers in terms of taking their content layer as a pure API and working with the tools they are used to. All thanks to this kind of modern distributed architecture where we've gone from like the big monolithic applications where everything lived within one sort of bucket, where you had the whole technology stack, the templating language, the plugin ecosystem, and the environment settings and so on, all being tied to the same like server and database and application running typically for every request coming in, with some caching layers, sometimes a lot of advanced caching layers, but fundamentally with that kind of model. And then what happened sort of early on was that we started asking ourselves like what would happen if we really like changed that model around and said like let the front end be the king, and let's start with that kind of like the direct user-facing layer. How do we build like great UIs for the people visiting our websites or web applications? And if we start from the front end, right, like we can really try to pre-build that front end from the data sources, put it directly on a CDN, and talk to both different APIs, sometimes during this build phase and sometimes directly from the browser to different services that sometimes we run ourselves and sometimes we delegate to players in this ecosystem like Stripe or Golia or whatever. And once you really start that, we started seeing that changing that kind of architecture also starts changing sort of the culture of the teams working with it. Sometimes we can iterate much faster on the UX layer that's client-facing, because we can have small front-end teams just working completely independently from sort of the big back-end layer or database layer. We get a very different developer experience for those teams and a faster pace of iteration. And generally, like a company like mine, we've really strived all the time to sort of reduce the time it takes to go from a concept to a URL you can share with someone. And the way we traditionally worked, right, like before this kind of paradigm shift, we often had this like big cycle where we like update the code, test it locally, and then push them into Git, and then there would be like this whole staging environment that we would run it in for a while that would go out of sync with the production environment, and that would be different from our local environment, and so on. And like on Netlify, one of the early things we did was saying, like, if we really just decouple this front-end display layer, we can tie it directly into this Git versioning concept and just make sure that every single deploy like every single Git push you do gets a deploy that gets a URL that you can share with someone. And we took it into this idea of like, every time you open up a branch, every time you open up a pull request, we'll run a build, we'll take this front end, we'll give you a URL that you can share with someone and that you can validate. And what we sort of did there was saying that like, the staging environment we run those deploys on is exactly the same as the production environment, and each of these deploys are just immutable front-end builds out there that you can verify with the same set of edge rules, the same set of CDN rules, the same set of everything as you will have once you merge these into master and push them into production. But then what we started seeing, like once you start working with this architecture, you have all these different services. You have your front end decoupled for your CDN, like from your CMS, and you have sort of a CDN that starts running all these edge rules you start needing for redirects, for proxying, and so on. How do you then work locally, right? Like, it's great to have a URL you can share and that you can pass along once you deploy, and it's great that deployment process gets iterative, like constantly faster and constantly easier. But you still need to have the direct experience of working locally. One of the things that we've seen being tricky is that once you sort of really embrace this concept of like, you pre-build the front end, you distribute it directly on a distributed network. In our case, we call it like our application delivery network. You also start like saying, some of those things I used to do in my traditional web server, like GeoIP-based language versioning or proxy rules or redirect rules and so on. Now they suddenly have to happen in the CDN level, and suddenly that's like sometimes a completely different team that manages that and so on. How can we make that easier to work with? These APIs and services we connect to, like often they need environment variable set that tells us like, should I talk to this one or this one? Which content space should I load content from, and so on. Now we have to start managing them across your staging environments, your production environments, and your local environment. How do we best do that? And some of the microservices you might build today as serverless functions with services like AWS Lambda or Google Functions or Netlify Functions. And again, like, it becomes a question of how do I run those effectively locally? So what we started seeing, like, initially in this process was that the traditional sort of local host became local nope. And what we then tried to do with this was saying, okay, what can we do to make sure that people can actually work with this whole kind of stack in a local development environment? So a few months ago, we launched Netlify Dev in beta, and are still developing like rapidly on it. It's a command line tool, and it's essentially like a local development server installed from NPM. You just install Netlify's general CLI tool, and now you can run Netlify Dev from any folder. And the idea here is that it brings our, like, all of Netlify's sort of distributed platform locally. We had to jump through some hoops. So as part of our platform, we run a pretty advanced application delivery network with an edge logic engine that allow you to do like anything from really simple redirects, like send this URL to this URL, to quite complex redirects like gate access to this piece of content unless the user have a web token with the admin role set. And again, question becomes, how do we test it locally? We managed to get it all to run in WebAssembly locally on your machine, so you can like test it. We made sure that this like runs, like work with all the standard build tools, so it works with Gatsby, Nuxt, and so on out of the box. It lets you, as I said, test this edge logic on your local machine. It will also like sync any of the environment variables you set up for a project in your Netlify site with your local environment, and it will let you compile and ship serverless functions. So let me give you a sense of how this looks like. Okay, so I'm going to start by just creating, like, normally you would build JAMstack projects with some site generator and a build tool and headless CMS and so on, but I want to just start with the most simple and just make like a plain, a completely plain HTML website, right? So I'll make a little public folder and just build a little index HTML in there with the minimum things we need here: doc type, some HTML tags, and a title. And let's add a little body and say, oops. There we go. Let's close the rest of this up and deploy it to Netlify. Okay, here we go. So obviously that's just a basic HTML page. I'll add a little, at Netlify we have a little configuration format in TOML that allows me to say, in this case I don't have any build tool, otherwise I would tell Netlify what build tool to use. In this case I would just say publish the public folder, and that's essentially it. And I'll do an initial deploy to production. And I'll try to spell Netlify right. So now this, like, again, most of the time when you work on a real life project, you'll set up like a CI/CD flow with Netlify, you'll connect the headless CMS or some kind of data source, you'll have a build tool and everything. But this just to give a sense of like the ease of actually getting something onto a URL on the same kind of production setup that you would later on use for your real code. So here we got suspicious Alan this time, and we can open up our Hello World page on our CDN. Now I want to start iterating locally, right? So let me just start Netlify Dev. This gives me, like in this case, just a basic HTTP server for my standard HTML content, since we're not using any build tool or anything. And of course, as we would expect, if I open a new window and I go in and change some things, we'll update the site and so on. But then let's go in and start adding some edge rules. So this is the thing that this is Netlify's redirect format. It's our way of defining like CDN edge rules for redirects or proxying or anything like that, and I just like do a really straightforward 301 redirect from demo back to the home. And just by adding this file locally, we'll see that if I go here, I'm getting redirected back home, and it works as expected, right? But we can do some more advanced stuff. So let's say instead of this, let's try this kind of rule that's a little more advanced, that says like anything under here, just show the index HTML. This would, for example, be the typical single page application app like rule for any kind of React app and so on, where we always just want to show the app skeleton no matter what URL we're going to write, and we're seeing like that redirect rules comes in. But we could also do something more fun, like say, let's proxy everything that doesn't match a file on the CDN to an external origin, like in this case, netlify.com splat with a 200. So again, now we'll start seeing if I go to the root, we'll just show the index HTML, it's there. But if I go to, for example, pricing, we'll proxy directly from my local dev server to Netlify, right? And this will work exactly the same whether I run this locally or whether I need now take that and ship it to Netlify. We can also start doing some fun things like, let's say we want to internationalize this Hello World site, right? So we go in and start translating to Spanish. Let's take the English version and go down here. And translate it. And of course, now I can go to that HTML file and I can see it, right? But that's not really what we normally want people to do. So I can go in here and I can say, okay, let's make a rule that says if you go to the home page, then show the Spanish version if the language is Spanish. So in this case, I'll go here and I'll see the hello world. But if I actually jump into my browser preferences and I find the language preference and I go in here and say, let me get everything in Spanish. Hola mundo, right? Again, this is like pretty advanced rules, and the power here is that if I actually ship this and deploy it to Netlify, it'll work exactly the same way as it works locally. It's our full Edge engine that we've compiled down to WebAssembly and run on your local laptop, so there'll never be any sort of discrepancy between how they work. And now let's look at adding some serverless functions to this setup. So I'll add a functions folder here. This just tells Netlify that when I do a deploy, I should deploy all the functions inside this folder as serverless Lambda functions and set up the routing for them and everything. And we also have like a little scaffolding tool. So let's say we want to create a hello function. I can just say create. I'll get a few options for like a basic template here. I'll just say pick the hello world one. We can take a quick look at how that function looks like. It's just a basic handler saying hello to a subject. And I might want to just restart to pick up the functions folder as well. And here we go. By default, any function that gets deployed from a folder you can find through like a path called .netlify/functions and then the name of the function, right? So if I go here, I'll get this hello world message. But let's say we want to give it a nicer URL. Now we can start combining things. So I can go in here and say, okay, in this redirects file, let me take the hello path and then just redirect it to functions hello with 200. And again, if I go in here and say hello, here we go. The Netlify Dev tooling also handles like function, like bundling function dependencies and so on. So if we start by actually turning this into a little NPM project, and then doing, I think the random name package would probably be a good candidate. So we added a little package to our package, to sort of our global package JSON file, a random name. Let's try to actually use it from our function. We'll require, the random name package. And then instead of this, let's just say random first should give us a first name. Here we go. We now get random names at this URL. And if I go back in here and then go back to this Netlify deploy with a production flag, you'll see that we'll actually like ship this again to the CDN, to our suspicious Allen URL, and I can go here. You see the GeoIP-based redirects work at our like globally distributed network as well. If I go to this hello function, we'll now actually be invoking a Lambda function through our like integrated API gateway. We'll have bundled up the dependencies. We actually like go through the AST of your function and figure out like which of the dependencies in the package JSONs should we bundle with this function to make the package as small as possible, and then ship them directly to AWS Lambda. So that's sort of the case of starting completely from scratch. I prepared a little Gatsby site here, just to give a sense of how it is to work with an actual static site generator. it's sort of very similar. I can just type Netlify Dev in this folder, and if I've prepared everything right for the demo, we'll pick up that this is a Gatsby project. We'll infer the underlying dev server command, and then essentially Netlify Dev is setting a dev server in front that implements all of the function logic, the redirect logic, and so on, but still gives you the underlying the underlying Gatsby server. So if I go here, I have like a little Gatsby side, and if I open this project, and let's say we want to edit the URL here, we'll see that the normal like hot reloading with Gatsby and so on still works exactly as it would normally do. And let's try to go in here. Let's just double check that everything's set up. Yeah, the functions are ready. In this case, we have a build command so that when we set up the CI/CD pipeline for this, our pipeline will automatically know that it should run yarn build every time there's a git commit and so on. But again, I'm just demonstrating sort of the local development flow and the quick sort of iteration of sharing to a URL. Let's add a different kind of function here. I'll call it fauna. And then I'll pick, like we're starting to see, as I mentioned, we're starting to see this whole ecosystem of like services and related vendors and so on. And one of them that's already sort of built an add-on for Netlify is FaunaDB. So FaunaDB is a globally distributed object database. They run across like several nodes all over the world. And if I spawn this function, we'll both like create a little scaffold for a CRUD function with Fauna, but Netlify will also actually provision a new instance of FaunaDB across their different cloud regions, and we'll set up a little item schema. And if we go in and look in the new functions folder, there's like a Fauna, like set of Fauna functions. We can take a look at like the read all one and see that we also, like just from scaffolding this, installed the relevant dependencies. And we can see like this is Fauna sort of deep in the weeds query language. They also have like a GraphQL adapter, so you can just write GraphQL directly against the schema and so on. But in this case, I'm just going to show this basic functionality, and then let's restart our dev server with this function. Spinning up the Lambda listeners and the actual dev server. I'm going to go here, and you'll see that I've chilled a little and prepared like a guestbook component that will let me do this, right? So this is actually an example, like I'm running this locally, the functions are running locally, my annoying virus scanner is popping up locally, and still from this I've actually spun up a globally distributed database. I've set the relevant environment variables, so the functions running locally in my laptop knows which instance to connect to and talk to, and duplicate an environment that will work exactly the same if I push this to production. And apart from that, like as I talked about initially, like we have this idea of like, so getting from concept to a URL you can share with people as fast as humanly possible. And of course, like it's really fast to push this to Netlify and take it live there. But we can also do something even faster. If I type Netlify Dev /live, we'll spin up the same little live server, but instead of giving you a little URL on localhost that you can open in the browser, I'm gonna be giving us, ideally if I hadn't had a weird development version installed locally, I should have checked that before the demo. I would have given you a live URL on Netlify.live that you can immediately share with any client, with any college, that anyone around the world can access, that runs on our infrastructure, but proxies all the way down to your local dev server, so you can immediately share with live reloading and everything what you're working on as you're working on it. And that's sort of the core of what we are starting to build, to really go from what you can do with the JAMstack today in terms of like running a CI/CD pipeline, connecting to all these different tools and getting it live, and bringing that back to a local development experience that can really accelerate the pace that front-end teams can iterate at and move at. Thank you. Any questions?
You said this is in dev right now. Do you have a sense of when it'll be available?
And so it's available for everybody, right? Like it's in public beta. We still have some glitches to iron out in the protocols we use to ship like under the covers when you connect to a live URL. For example, we open a TCP connection to your local server and then use protocol buffers to send back and forth the HTTP messages and so on. But there's still some small glitches there we're working on refining with when you deal with like chunk responses and stuff like that. We're still iterating really heavily on the developer experience around when things don't go perfectly right, when we don't detect your exact build settings, so things like that, and how we can make sure that people get a great experience there. But the core tooling is all like we're using it internally all the time for our setup. Yeah.
Can you talk about more complex functions?
Yeah.
Like, what would be something that just the power of the functionality of those functions?
Yeah. So I mean, we've seen pretty much everything from people putting like an express server in a function and talking to the MongoDB database and running that, right? One example that we use is that every time you do a deploy with Netlify, we'll take a little screenshot in that deploy and it'll show up in your dashboard. And that's actually a Netlify function running as part of app.netlify.com, which is deployed with Netlify, that uses headless Chrome to take a screenshot of the deploy you just made and return it, right? So that's one of our own internal examples. Often we also just see functions as sort of the basic mechanism for, like, imagine you're building a client-side driven e-commerce site, for example, right? And you can build like Sarah Drasner just gave a talk in London where she showed how to build like an e-commerce with Nuxt and Vue, and everything is built up front, and you have the whole catalog, you have a Stripe checkout, and once you go and buy a product, you go through the Stripe checkout. But obviously, like, to actually charge money with Stripe, you need a little bit of server-side code running with an API secret that you can't share client-side, and you really shouldn't share client-side, right? So often we also just see functions as that kind of glue layer that ties together a lot of different APIs. But we've seen the whole range from like actual express function applications just running in a function endpoint to headless Chrome to like simple wrappers around Stripe and the like.
Just to follow up, are the functions called when the server is loaded or call on gateway?
That really depends on the routing rules you set up for the functions, right? So typically we encourage, like with sort of a JAMstack approach, we encourage you to build, like, to not use the functions to do like server-side rendering on HTML and so on. There's still a bunch of people doing that, right? Like, and there's nothing stopping you from it, right? But we generally encourage an architecture where you more like pre-build the fundamental markup from your content, and then talk to functions when you actually want some action to happen or trigger something. I think we are out of time. Thank you.